From the pulpit of the First Baptist Church of Dallas, Texas, this is Pathway to Victory with Dr. Robert Jeffress.
Hi, I'm Robert Jeffress, and welcome again to Pathway to Victory. For decades, 3 Supreme Court decisions have dramatically altered America's moral landscape and led our nation away from God. One of these rulings, Roe v. Wade in 1973, legalized abortion nationwide. Thankfully, since I first preached this message, the Supreme Court has overturned that terrible decision. But make no mistake about it, the battle is far from over. Any nation or state that sanctions the murder of unborn children is destined for God's judgment. My message is titled, America at the Crossroads, on today's edition of Pathway to Victory.
Jesus declared, "You are the salt of the earth and the light of the world." With so much darkness creeping into our schools and communities, now is the time to answer that calling. Become the salt and light the world desperately needs through the Pathway to Victory Salt and Light Matching Challenge. Your gift today, doubled in ministry impact, will empower Pathway to Victory to proclaim the gospel and stand for biblical truth. Push back and hold strong against moral decline by joining the Salt and Light Matching Challenge.
You remember a few years ago when God led us to completely recreate this campus here in downtown Dallas. We were faced with the task, okay, what do you do with all the old buildings? How do you remove hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of square feet of space in all these old buildings? And so we met with the demolition people, and they said, well, Pastor, the best way to do this is through an implosion. I said, an what? I said, an implosion. And they said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take hundreds of pounds of dynamite. We will attach the dynamite to key structural supports within these buildings. We'll explode the dynamite. There'll be a pause, and then the law of physics will take over, and the buildings will collapse under their own weight. I said, well, that sounds good to me. Let's go for it. Who will ever forget on that Saturday morning in October a few years ago when we watched the implosion of the First Baptist Church in Dallas? I mean, it was exciting stuff. We had the news media from all over the world here. CNN was there, but more importantly, Fox News was carrying it live on Fox and Friends. Everybody loves an implosion. And we stood on a building overlooking our campus, and they had that big red button. I tell you, I've never been more excited. They did the countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I pressed the red button. And after the pressing of the red button, that was followed by the exploding dynamite. And the exploding dynamite was followed by nothing. Absolutely nothing happened. I cannot tell you the unholy thoughts that were going through my mind at the moment. I mean, my first thought is, which staff member am I going to fire first for this? I mean, I was embarrassed. I mean, 17 million people were watching this worldwide. I could see this scene being replayed endlessly on YouTube. Pastor's implosion, a dud. But what I forgot was, they told me there was going to be a pause between the explosion and the collapse. It seemed like an eternity, but it was only a few seconds until we started feeling the ground start vibrating underneath us. Those buildings started swaying back and forth. Well, you remember what happened. Look at it for a moment. I learned something that morning about implosions. They are sudden, they are dramatic. They begin with a series of seemingly unrelated explosions, followed by a pause, and then a sudden collapse. Ladies and gentlemen, over the last 50 years, there have been 3 explosive decisions by our United States Supreme Court that have so weakened the moral and spiritual infrastructure of this nation that our country's collapse is inevitable. We've already had the explosions. The implosion is coming. We're just living in that moment of delay. You say, well, what are those explosive decisions, Pastor? The first one occurred in 1962. It was the Supreme Court case of Engel versus Vitale. This is the case that removed prayer from the public schools. Of course, this was just the first in a series of court decisions against Christianity and faith in the public square. In 1963, Bible reading was removed from the school, and on and on and on it went until 1980. In the case of Stone versus Graham, the United States of the Supreme Court said you can no longer even post copies of the Ten Commandments in a Kentucky school. And why did the court say you can't do that? If I were to summarize the court's ruling, you would think I was making it up. So I want you to hear verbatim why the Supreme Court of the United States now says you can no longer post the Ten Commandments in a school. Quote, if the posted copies of the Ten Commandments are to have any effect at all, it will induce the school children to read, meditate upon, perhaps venerate and obey the commandments. This is not a permissible state objective under the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Can you believe that? The Supreme Court says we can't post those 10 commandments in a school because if we post them, the children might actually read them. And if they read the 10 commandments, they may begin to respect them, to venerate them. And if they begin to respect the 10 commandments, God forbid, they might actually obey the 10 commandments, and that's unconstitutional. How in the world do you explain that? Especially in light of the fact that 118 years before that court decision, the Supreme Court of the United States weighed in on another case. The case was, can you teach the New Testament in the public schools? It was the case of Vidal versus Girard's executors. And the question was, can you teach the New Testament in the school? And the Supreme Court almost laughed this decision out. Well, of course you can. Why wouldn't you be able to teach the New Testament in the school? Literally, the court wrote, why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as a divine revelation in the school? The general precepts expounded, the evidences explained, and its glorious principles of morality inculcated. Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament? That was the Supreme Court of the United States. And then, 111 years later, in 1980, the Supreme Court suddenly says, you can't even post, much less talk about the 10 Commandments in the public school. You know, every time I'm debating one of these pinhead lawyers from the ACLU or the Freedom from Religion Foundation on Fox News, I always ask them about this. I said, can you explain to me why in the 1860s it was constitutional to teach the Bible or to pray or to put nativity scenes in the public school, but in 1980, 120 years later, you can't even post the copies of the 10 Commandments? Can you explain to me what changed? Did the Constitution change and nobody told us about it? And do the judges today have greater insight into what our founders meant than those who lived closest to the founders? No, they never have an answer for that, but I've got an answer for what changed. What changed is this. We have allowed the atheists, the infidels, the humanists to seize control of this country and to pervert our Constitution into something the founders never intended. That is what's happened, and we've got to say enough to that. We've got to say enough to it. Now look, our founders were clear. In the First Amendment, they said, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion. Our forefathers came from a country where there was a state church and people were coerced to worship in churches they didn't want to be in. That was wrong. Our forefathers said, we want no part of that, and you and I don't want any part of that. But the First Amendment absolutely has nothing to say about nativity scenes, or prayers at graduations, or 10 Commandment displays. It has absolutely nothing to say about that. Our country was founded as a Christian nation. And although we allow and welcome people of all faiths or no faiths, this country was founded as a Christian nation. But let me tell you what happened. About 50 years ago, starting in 1962, The secularists, the infidels in our country said, let's try an experiment. We're going to see if America can be good without God. That is, instead of abiding by the moral absolutes found in God's word, we'll just let everybody form their own morality. And furthermore, we won't judge anybody else's morality. Everybody is free to decide what's right or wrong for himself. The second explosion occurred in 1973. And it was a case that actually started right here in Dallas, a few blocks from this church. 1973, the case of Roe versus Wade, the court case that legalized abortion in our country. And since the Roe decision, more than 60 million children have been murdered in the womb, and an additional 1.3 million children are murdered every year through abortion. What is God's attitude toward a nation that not only allows but celebrates the freedom? And I never let people end it there. I never let them say the freedom to choose. I always make them complete the sentence. But celebrates the freedom to choose to murder your own child. What does God say about a nation like that? All you have to do is look at how God dealt with his own nation of Israel. I mean, really, when you think about it, Israel was the only nation that could be truly called God's chosen people. God created Israel. He has a special blessing for Israel. But remember what happened when they went into the promised land? They started following after the pagan god Moloch and started adopting the worship of Moloch. And part of the worship of that Canaanite god involved the sacrifice of children. The Israelites would take their own young children, even their babies, and burn them alive on the altar of Moloch. And when God looked down and he saw what his own people were doing, in Jeremiah 32:35, he said, it would not have even entered my mind that you would have done such a detestable thing. But because you have, this is what I'm going to do. I will raise up the Babylonians, the terrorists of your day, if you will, and they will invade your land and they will take you captive. And that's exactly what God did. If God is going to deal with his own nation of Israel that way, is there any real doubt of what God is going to do to America? The third explosion occurred January the 26th, 2015. It was the case of Obergefell versus Hodges. This was the Supreme Court case that legalized same-sex marriage. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Oh, Pastor, why do we have to talk about that? Why do we have to talk about it? I mean, if gays want to get married, they love one another, why do you get so worked up about that? It's no skin off of your nose. You must be homophobic to talk about this. No, we don't hate gay people. We don't hate anybody. But the reason we stand against gay marriage is because we know how that story ends. We know what the end result is. Sociologists have done a long-term study. The Hoover Institute has done a long-term study of Scandinavian countries that legalized same-sex marriage years ago. And you know what they discovered? It was very interesting. They discovered after 10 years, not that many gays actually ended up getting married. What they found was instead the rate of heterosexual marriage declined precipitously. You say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Why would gays being allowed to marry have anything to do with the heterosexual marriage rate declining? Well, that's an easy one. Whenever you counterfeit something, you cheapen the value of the real thing. I mean, if marriage is whatever you want it to be, a man and a woman, two men, two women, three men and a woman, if it's whatever you want it to be, why even bother going through the hassle of getting married? And that's what's happening in our country already. In the last 2 years, the marriage rate has declined among heterosexuals to the lowest in 92 years. And we know the implications on society for that. We know what happens when children are reared in an atmosphere without a father or a mother. I mean, sociology studies have shown that SAT scores plummet, depression and suicide rates, drug use increase. You see, children are designed in such a way that they need both a father and a mother. You know, Sarah McClanahan is a sociologist at Princeton University. Now, this isn't Dallas Theological Seminary, this is Princeton University. And she said one time, if we were trying to design the ideal environment in which to rear a child, it would be one in which the child was connected to both of its biological parents. You know, I remember so well a few years ago when one of these decisions attacking traditional marriage came down from the Supreme Court. I was on Fox News the night of that decision debating a gay activist. And I'd done some research on him and discovered that he and his partner had just adopted a child. And so I was talking about the sociological studies of why children need both a father and a mother. And as I was talking about that, he interrupted me and he said, Pastor, I just want you to know I'm offended by what you're saying, because you're suggesting that a heterosexual relationship is superior to a homosexual relationship. I said, well, sir, I'm sorry you're offended, but the fact is you wouldn't be alive here and arguing with me tonight if it were not a heterosexual relationship that had brought you into this world. I mean, that is God's way of saying this is a special relationship. Now, I know that's not always possible to have a father and mother, death, divorce, other things, but government ought to be encouraging that ideal relationship instead of counterfeiting it. Now, here's my point in all of this. What I'm simply saying is this: no nation that outlaws the mention of God in the public square, that celebrates the murder of its own children, that destroys the most basic unit of society, the family, no nation is going to survive that. The explosions have already happened. The implosion is coming. We are just living in that in-between time. What are we supposed to do about that? Some of you are saying, this is the most depressing message I've ever listened to. No, this is not depressing as long as you understand our purpose as Christians. If you understand our purpose as Christians, there's never been a better time to be alive and living in America than right now, as long as we understand the mission. What are we supposed to be doing right now? Jesus told us in Matthew chapter 5. Turn there to Matthew 5, verse 13. You probably never thought we'd get into the Bible. Here we are right now. Matthew 5, Jesus said, first of all, you are the salt of the earth, verse 13. But if the salt has become tasteless, how will it be made salty again? It is good for nothing anymore except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Jesus said we are to be salt in this decaying world. Now remember, in Jesus' day, salt was a preservative. Before the days of refrigeration, salt was used as a preservative. Now get this, salt could not prevent the decay of meat, but it could delay the decay of meat. Salt gave the meat a longer shelf life. Eventually, the meat would rot and would have to be thrown out. But the salt helped preserve it for a little bit longer. Now, Jesus said in the same way, the reason he has left us in this world instead of taking us to heaven immediately is to be a preservative in this world. To not prevent the decay, but to delay the decay of the world. Now, before salt can impact meat, guess what? It has to penetrate the meat. As long as it stays in the salt shaker, it is absolutely worthless. And I'm going to tell you one thing that really concerns me is the number of Christians, the number of pastors who are still in the salt shaker. They have siloed themselves. They have said things like, oh, well, if it's all going to end anyway, why should I even bother to get involved? You know, we're going to hell in a handbasket. Why should I do anything? Shouldn't we be welcoming Jesus' return anyway? Why should we care about what's happening in the culture? You know how I respond to that? I know I'm going to die one day. Nothing's going to change that. But the reason I get up and run every morning, the reason I gag down that Raisin Bran for breakfast instead of an Egg McMuffin every day, the reason I do those things is to delay the inevitable. Not to prevent it, but to delay it. And it's not because I'm afraid of dying. It's I want to live here as long as I can and do what God has called me to do before I go home to meet the Lord. And it's the same way with our culture. We're not afraid of the end. We know the best chapter is yet to be revealed when Christ returns. But the Bible says we're to push back against evil. We're to try to delay the premature collapse of our country and our world so that we have longer to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. How do we do that? How do we push back against evil in the world? One way we do it in our country, a major way we do it, is through the government officials that we elect. Now, I know some of you are saying, we knew Jeffress was going to get involved in politics. If we came here today, we knew this was going to be a political message. Christians shouldn't be involved in politics, and pastors certainly shouldn't be involved in politics. Well, before you say that, remember two things. Number one, God is the one who designed government. Government is God's idea. Did you know the Bible says there are 3 institutions that God created? Not 2, not 5, there are 3. In Genesis 2, he created the family. In Genesis 9, he created the government. And in Acts chapter 2, he created the church. Did you know government is just as ordained and holy as the church is? Government is just as ordained by God as the church is. Both were created by God for unique purposes. Government's not been called to share the gospel, we have, but government has been called to be a restrainer of evil. God designed government to keep order and morality in society. And that means when we elect government officials, we are determining the moral and spiritual direction of our country. And that's the second thing I want you to understand about government. We have the privilege of choosing our leaders. Every time we go into the voting booth, we decide which direction this nation is going to be headed. You know, just think about this. In the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, you didn't get to vote for the king. You didn't get to vote for the emperor of Rome. That was kind of given to you. But John Jay, the first Chief Justice of our United States Supreme Court, said this. He said, God has given us the privilege in this Christian nation of choosing our leaders. Isn't that interesting? The first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court said, this is a Christian nation. He said, God has given us in this Christian nation the privilege of choosing our leaders. That means every time we go into the voting booth, we are casting a vote for righteousness or we're casting a vote for unrighteousness. We are the ones who are determining the moral and spiritual direction of this nation. Time is running short, and the Bible calls us to make every effort to push back against the forces of evil in order to delay the decay of our nation. Now, in closing, I want to remind you that we're coming up on a significant deadline. This Sunday, July 6th, Pathway to Victory will conclude the Salt and Light Matching Challenge. There's still time to double the impact of your gift, but you need to respond right away. We're asking God to use men and women just like you to help us reach and even exceed the $1 million goal. Jesus declared, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world." And God will use your generous gifts to help push back against the moral decline in our nation as we serve as the salt and light our world desperately needs. Thank you so much for your support. Now stay right there. I'll be back with more Pathway to Victory in just a moment.
The moral decline in today's world can feel overwhelming, but God calls us to shine His light and make a difference for Him in a world that has lost its way. In his brand new book, Shine the Light, Dr. Robert Jeffress shows you how small, faithful acts like teaching, serving, and encouraging can restore and renew Christian values in your family, your church, and community.
The Bible teaches that our primary purpose in life is to influence the world with the gospel. And in my new book, I'll show you how to live purposefully and leave behind a legacy of faith, wisdom, and compassion.
The world may seem lost, but God's light has not dimmed, and neither has yours. Request your copy of Shine the Light when you give a generous gift to the Pathway to Victory Salt and Light Matching Challenge. And when your ministry gift is $100 or more, we'll also send you the complete Shine the Light teaching series on DVD and audio disc.
Light is of little value in the light. If we're going to be effective, we're effective for Christ not when we're around other light sources, other Christians. It is when we are in the darkness. Light has to confront the darkness.
Remember, your gift today will have twice the impact thanks to the Pathway to Victory Salt and Light Matching Challenge. Thank you for partnering with Pathway to Victory as we boldly proclaim the gospel and equip believers to shine God's light in a world that has lost its way.
The explosives have detonated, and America's moral foundation is cracking. Today, I describe 3 monumental Supreme Court decisions that altered our nation's course. While Roe v. Wade has been overturned, abortion still remains an issue, now decided by individual states. And my premise stands firm. God will not bless America as long as we murder children in the womb. Next time, I'll explain how we can influence our culture for God's kingdom and why there's never been a better time to be living in America than right now. Stay tuned for a preview of what's coming up next in our series, Shine the Light. If you don't hear another word I say this morning, hear this. What we're facing in this country is not a battle between Republicans and Democrats. It is a battle between good and evil, between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Satan. That's exactly what is at stake in this country.
Set your DVR and join us next time for part 2 of the message, America at the Crossroads, here on Pathway to Victory.
Each of us will leave a legacy. What will your legacy be? Your legacy giving can further the gospel and be an example to your children about what matters most in life. The world my daughters and grandchildren are growing up in is vastly different than the one you and I grew up in. The gospel of Jesus Christ is our only answer, and naming Pathway to Victory as a beneficiary in your will helps guarantee that there will be a trusted ministry that will continue to be salt and light. Like the ripples that emanate from a rock thrown into a pond, your influence for Christ can keep going on and on after you die with a gift in your will. What will your legacy be? Only one life will soon be passed. Only what's done for Christ will last.